Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Refurbishment is one of the most talked about strategies in property investing. The idea of buying a tired property, improving it and creating value sounds straightforward. But the reality is many investors underestimate just how complex refurbishment projects can be. Budgets run over, timelines slip, contractors disappear, and sometimes value investors expect simply doesn't materialize. What looked like a profitable project on paper can quickly become stressful, expensive, and time-consuming. But when refurbishment is approached properly, with the right planning, realistic budgeting, and a clear understanding of what actually adds value, it can be one of the most powerful ways to improve returns and reposition properly. So today, we're joined by Martin Rapley from Refurbishment Mastery to talk about the realities of refurbishment projects, the mistakes investors often make, and how to approach refurbishments in a way that is structured, controlled, and ultimately profitable. Let's jump in. Welcome, Martin. Great to have you here. How's things?
Oh, I'm very good. Thanks very much. Thanks very much for inviting me to be here today.
Yeah, no worries. Look, we're really excited to have you on the podcast. We have, as you know, the Prime Property Finance podcast, we try and help investors really understand how property finance works around various types of deals, strategies and structures. However, the core principle, one of the core principles within property investing to get the most value out of deals is generally buy, refurbish, refinance, or buy, refurbish and sell, from a development perspective. But both of those to the core work in the very same way. And what we talk about in terms of buy, refurbish, refinance is, as the finance professionals within that process, we can help people acquire the property. So we help them with the buy and we help them with the refinance once the project's complete and once they've added value in whichever way that is, but generally through refurb. But what we don't get involved in at all is the refurb side of things. We are not, whilst we've done our own property projects and a number of them, we aren't property specialists in terms of refurbs. We're not builders, we're not QSs, etc. And ultimately, that's where your experience lies. So great person to have on the podcast. We've had many professionals in different areas, but really excited to have you on the show today and get to know a little bit about what you do and how you help investors from your side of things. So do you want to just give us a bit of background about where you've been, what your experience is within property?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is actually construction. I was originally a contractor's quantity surveyor. So that's the person who looks after the finances for the delivery of construction projects. This actually now goes back over 40 years to 1985. So, cut my teeth on building sites as a trainee surveyor, got good at making the tea and answering the phone and all the things like that, but progressed on and ended up going forwards and doing quantity surveying for a good number of years, and then moved sideways into project management and whole delivery of projects, and started to realize at that point that the success of a delivery of a project wasn't just how good your builders and tradesmen were on site. It came down to the whole process and the whole team. And I was doing a lot of work in blue chip properties, mostly around London. I'm based in Kent. So a lot of my career has been in London. I was in museums, I was in occupied offices, I was in schools, I was in police stations and things like that, legitimately in police stations, I might add. And we realised that if I couldn't sort out the security side of it, if I hadn't got clarity, if I hadn't worked out how to work around the public, projects started to go wrong. And I did some fantastic projects in London over a number of years. I ran my own construction company for a while, and through that, met a lot of property investors that I was feeling at the time really needed some help. They didn't appear to have anyone to talk to, and yet they were approaching me as a builder as though I was the guru. And to a certain extent, I was, but I was also well aware that a lot of my competitors were not going to be giving the professional service that I was delivering, because I wasn't the builder myself. I was employing my own tradesmen. Anyone who went straight to a tradesman was not going to get the service I was delivering. And that kind of led me to get intrigued about what property investors were all about, really. And I started going to some property investing meetings. And then I thought, well, the best thing to do is some training so that I understand where my knowledge and skills might fit around property investors. So I went along to a training course, and of course I was taught about motivated sellers and how to negotiate deals, and nothing was mentioned about the refurbishment. I was thinking, this is really weird, because everyone's being taught how to buy a cracking deal, but no one's taught how not to lose money at that next stage. That, we've got the B covered, but that refurbishment. So I set up a consultancy business originally as a project manager to work with property investors and manage projects on their behalf. And a lot of property investors were saying, Martin, what you're doing is brilliant, but we can't afford you on a small refurbishment, on a small house to HMO conversion. Will you run some training courses? And I didn't have any intention of running a training course until a guy I knew, and then by now we're up to about 2014, 2015 or so. And a guy I knew said to me, I'll fill a hotel room up and you can come along and deliver some content. And I said, well, if you really insist. Well, it was a brilliant day. I had loads of people in the room, and there was just people queuing up. We outsold the tickets, and people were queuing up to hear more about what I could deliver. Along the way, I've become a property investor, of course, myself. I've got HMOs and flats, mostly in Dover and Kent now, although I do actually have some flats not far from you, just outside Blackwood, actually, in the valleys, which I acquired a good number of years ago. And now I don't do any project management any longer. I still do a little bit of quantity surveying. All I'm about now is training, mentoring, guiding and supporting property investors that are managing their refurbishments, mainly from the perspective that they're doing smaller projects that don't justify having a fully qualified project manager on board, and therefore they're doing it themselves. And I can close up gaps in their knowledge and help them follow a blueprint to have a more successful outcome of the average refurbishment.
Yeah, that sounds excellent, because I think, what I've done in the past, from my experience, is just going to speak to builder friends of mine, trades, professionals, and trying to lean on them. But ultimately, whilst that's helpful, you're always kind of leaning on them, but also that, they're busy and they've got other things going on. And whilst they can be very good at what they do, some people are not that great at teaching it either, are they? It's whereas if that's your job, to teach people how to do it, then you've got a focused person who's dealing with it, who's got the experience, who knows what you're trying to achieve as well, isn't it? So I think that there's huge value there.
Absolutely, and it becomes scalable as well, because if you do your first project on your own, and I'm sure lots of listeners have done that, and they muddle through and things don't quite go as planned, it maybe costs them a little bit more money, but it's not life-changing money. But if you keep replicating those poor processes and you grow and you're going into bigger projects, and suddenly you're now onto a big commercial to residential conversion, and there's 8 apartments you're creating, if you've still got some of those bad techniques, those errors that might have been a few £1,000s in the first place are now, in the extreme, up to hundreds of thousands of pounds, because no one's ever said, hold on, there's a better way of doing this, or you can shortcut this part of the process that you've got, because there's more professional ways of carrying out these refurbishments.
Yeah, definitely. No, I absolutely agree. So, we're quite aware, and I would imagine the majority of our listeners are quite aware of the attractiveness of refurbishment. The reason that we're trying to do refurbishment is to add value, right? In this BRR model, you buy low, sell or refinance high effectively, and you've got to do something to increase the value generally. And we're not talking about planning gains and lease extensions. The purpose of this conversation is about refurbishment. So we know we're adding value through refurbishment. And then the next part of that is how can we add as much value as possible for the lowest cost possible, isn't it? That's the perfect position to be in then, because you can spend as little as possible to get the most increase. Because the other thing that I see quite often is people effectively breaking even. They say, no, I'm buying it for this, I'm spending this, and this is what it's going to be worth. Well, why are you bothering? Because those numbers don't add up. You're going through a lot of work and effort there just to break even at the end. So unless there's another alternative reason why you'd want to do that, whether it's emotional or whether there's another reason, then there's no point in just going through the process just to break even, is there? Because there's plenty of deals out there that don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, if you're just planning on breaking even, you run the risk of going minus with one little thing turn up partway through the project that you hadn't expected in the first place. When you take out the kitchen and find all the floors rotten or something like that, it could tip you over. So, we both would have heard of the utopia of all of our money back out on a refinance, and that might still be possible in some circumstances. But from a refurbishment, as you say, you wanting to add value, we might not get all of our money out, but we want as much of it back out to recycle as we can. Because otherwise, as you say, we might just as well go and buy a property round the corner that someone else has refurbished. You don't get any of the stress and hassle of doing the refurbishment. You don't have to deal with builders, and you could move tenants in the next 3 to 4 weeks and have income from it. So if that's your model, and there's nothing wrong with that as a model, then great. But don't get to that position 4 months down the line, having had all the stress and hassle of doing a refurbishment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the challenges, and we'll come on to in a bit, but is that whilst there's been increases in property values, and they haven't hugely changed, there have been increases, of course, but they're not at the same rate that the cost of refurbs have increased. And so where you might have picked up a property, in the lower end for maybe 80,000 and then done a £20,000 refurb and it'd be worth 150, you're still picking up those properties for around 80,000, but those refurbs are coming in at sort of 40 or maybe more thousand, and still worth 150, 160. The margins, on those sweet spot deals seem to be becoming tighter and tighter. And so whilst we see clients doing, all money out deals quite often, but more often or not, they aren't all money out deals and they are leaving money in. And that's generally because being able to stack deals and the cost of refurbs.
Yeah, so the key thing with building costs is it's not just inflation that's driven the costs up. There's also things like the building regulations have become more onerous. The Grenfell fire obviously impacted the fire protection side of that as well. But the other thing is the threshold that hasn't really moved is the VAT threshold. And back in the day, lots of builders worked cash in hand, whether you agree with it or not, they did. And of course, you could refurbish a reasonable amount of property cash in hand with builders at the very low level, and even builders that were not VAT registered could do quite a lot of work. Whereas now, because the VAT threshold hasn't really moved over the years, most builders are now running VAT registered building businesses. Very few of them are now working in cash because of the difficulties with that. So that in itself has just pushed costs up as well. And then we start talking about Brexit, which forced a lot of the Eastern European labour to go home again, and COVID, which then saw off another few building contracting businesses. So all in all, it is difficult to be a builder at the moment, and everyone still wants the best possible price, but builders are naturally being forced to review their prices and push them up a little bit.
Yeah, and then you've just also had the cost price inflation, like you said, just in general around materials, and we're on the verge of potentially another war now in Iran and what's going on over there in the Middle East. And that's going to likely put some inflationary pressure back into the market when just things started to stabilize. So, plus we've had everything going on in Europe with the Ukraine and Russia war. So there always seems, and I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but I also think there's an element of, I wouldn't say price fixing, because I think that's too much of an aggressive term. But I honestly do think there's an element of, again, collusion. I don't know what the right word is, but I think in some markets, some suppliers of, let's say, materials and various things see an opportunity when there's negative news in the press to just put the prices up and then blame it on the circumstances that are actually in the market. Because ultimately, if you're doing projects and you need to buy plasterboards, you've got to buy them because the project has to go ahead. And so people will just pay whatever the price is for a plasterboard. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the big merchants can control prices very quickly and easily now. Again, back in the day, it was all locally priced. It was all local competition. But now merchants can pull on data from all over. And of course, the merchants that have just increased the price of your plasterboard, they bought this plasterboard and paid for it months ago, and it's been sitting in a big warehouse somewhere. So, they haven't really incurred additional costs. And I think, there's just more awareness of everything now, isn't there? So because there's more awareness of global disruption, it gets on the news and it's a reason for prices to go up. But I think there's also more awareness of the local builders. The builders are aware of who their competition is. I think I hesitate to say collusion like you did, but I think there's definitely more discussion going on now because of things like networking and, just other opportunities that have opened up that have meant builders are actually talking to each other. And without any doubt, those that are good are definitely in a position to nudge the prices up on a regular basis.
Yeah. Okay. So what are you seeing then where are the key things? You've got to the point of where you are now with your experience having spoken, and we've already touched on some of them. Where do investors get it wrong? What are the challenges or what are the challenges that they have, do you see?
So in order that things go wrong, first of all, is that their original budget and appraisal is inaccurate in some way. It could be that they've misunderstood the market from who's going to live in a property. It could be they don't know. They're aiming for top of the range properties, but they're using prices for lower range refurbishments. It could be that they're delivering an under-spec'd scheme in the wrong area, and they're not getting the value from a property that way. They're not adding the value they want. So that's an initial appraisal position. And then as we move down the line, the next thing is not really coming over to builders in a credible way that builders want to price the work for them and want to give them a competitive price, a legitimate competitive price. And that's all about having a clear specification of what you want. What does that property actually look like when the tenant moves in or when your buyer buys the property? Are you delivering what they need, nothing more than they need, but nothing less than they need? You shouldn't be leaving any of those decisions to builders. And if your spec comes over as wishy-washy, the good builders will invariably say, really sorry, I'm too busy to price the job. The builders you don't want to be working with will be seeing pound notes in their eyes, like we saw on the cartoons, because they're thinking, here's someone who's vague, uncertain. I can keep the price really low. I can bury some qualifications in my quote, and then I'll make up all of the money later on. And those aren't the builders you want to be working with. And to find those builders, not only do you need a good spec, you need to be talking to plenty of builders and eliminate the wrong ones. One of the biggest mistakes I see property investors making is they've spoken to two builders about their project. One of them's gone on holiday and can't do it and disappeared. The other one we didn't like, but he's really cheap and he can start on Monday. And by Wednesday, we've fallen out with him because we didn't like him and his price was rubbish. I would encourage investors to talk to plenty of builders, 8, 9, 10 builders or so, because one of them is going to go on holiday and can't do it. One of them's too busy at that time. One of them doesn't like working in this town. One of them doesn't do this. And now we've got 5 that are likely to do our project. And by the way, one of them drops off during the pricing process. So now we've got 4 prices. But with 4 prices, we can now choose the best builder. We're not forced to take the only builder who came back to me with a price. And best builder might be based on price, but it might be based on the speed they can start or the speed they can turn the project around in, or it could just be the builder that gave you the confidence that they could deliver and you wanted to work with all along. So yeah, get the original appraisal right. Spend some time finding good builders, spend some time putting together a schedule of works. And then I guess the fourth thing is, don't delegate the whole responsibility to the builder. Your builder might tell you that they've got a project manager, but you can rest assured that project manager's first goal is to look after their business. Their second goal is to let you believe that they're looking after you as number 2. And why do I say that? I can say that because for many, many years, I was the builder's project manager. And that was how we operated. Most of my clients were actually commercial blue chip clients. So it was fair game in those businesses. But I'm telling you, that's how builders operate. So you've still got to manage those builders. You've got to keep on top of them and you've got to challenge them. You've got to engage with them. And you've got to make sure that you're ahead of them as far as delivery of information or purchase of materials or anything like that you're involved with.
Yeah, great. Look, there's so much to unpick there. So I'll try and lay the questions out one at a time. So one of the challenges, I think, from an investor perspective is let's say you're looking at properties to do BRR. It could be if you're on the lower end of the market, it's quite competitive. And so you need to make decisions quickly. Based on what you've just told me, if I've got to go, well, I need to do a refurb in this property, it's a full gut. By the time I pull together a solid appraisal with a decent and clear specification and then go out to 10 builders, that's a pretty time-consuming process to get through that and do that. So would you suggest that it's best to do that upfront before you've even acquired the property? Or do you have a simpler method, such as a pound per square foot or pound per square meter based on the refurb or based on the property type or style or spec? Would you do that first, and kind of what's your thoughts on that? And then the second part is around the project manager you mentioned. Obviously, you can engage your own project manager on your behalf, but in your experience, where does that start to make sense financially from the size of a project? If you're doing a 10 grand refurb, I'm not sure that it's worth engaging a project manager. I don't know, and this is just interesting and I'm sure listeners, is it 50,000? Is it 75? Is it 100 or 100 plus? That's, yeah.
Okay. Well, so as far as what I was talking about, the schedule of work and finding builders, that you would only do that at the point where you actually know you're proceeding with a project. So you might not own the property yet, but it's nicely through the conveyance process to make a start at some point. As far as how do you get those figures right in the first place, the difficulty with refurbishments and conversions is there's no kind of standard benchmark as to what we're going to do in a property. Some properties we would replace the central heating system and rewire, but other properties we don't need to do that. Some properties we can get away with the existing bathroom and we only replace the kitchen. Other times we're doing more. Some properties we're adding more en suites to make it an HMO. We might go a little bit further and turn the staircase round to reconfigure the space. So there's no standard prices per square foot or per square meter for refurbishments. And the way I teach property investors is to effectively make a list of the work that needs doing and establish the reasonable price for each element of the project. So some property investors will say, oh, I've just put £50,000 in for the refurbishment. And my first question is, oh, that's a nice round number. How did we come to that? Because it's only when you start thinking it through and listing things out, you find that 50,000 could be too high, in which case you're potentially leaving a deal on the table, or could be too low, in which case you're just setting yourself up for problems further down the line. So break it all down into manageable chunks. And those, if you want prices for those manageable chunks, realistically, a lot of those are on the internet. You can do some research for realistic prices. If you want to rewire a 3-bedroom house, you'll find a range of prices on the internet. The thing that I see property investors missing is not the obvious, it's the hidden stuff. And the hidden stuff, for example, is we've got a through lounge dining room. We want to put the wall back in the middle because we're going to use the back room as an HMO bedroom, say. So we're going to build the wall back in. Oh, well, what's the cost of a wall? Well, it's a few £1,000s. It absolutely is. But did we spot that there's currently a radiator in the location of that wall? And did we spot that the lights are all configured through one light switch? So we've got to rewire the lights. And did we realise that where the door was into the old back room, they've now put the boiler in that place? And so my experience is not so much knowing just how to price the work, it's also looking deep enough when you go viewing a property as to what's going to trip you up when you do the work. Because when people say, oh, the builder wants 10 grand for this job, it's like, okay, well, let's have a look at it. And I'm reminded of a client who came to me years ago. She said, the builder wants £8,000 to put this ensuite bathroom in, and I can't see why. And then when we looked at where he had to go with the drainage pipe and all the boxing and casing he was going to have to do, and he had to dig a manhole and he had to dig it up through the back garden, it was like, I think it's the right price. But you can't, not every job's the same. So that's learn how to put together budgets, how to do high level budgets with round numbers, but not round 50,000s, round 1,000s.
And I think that's the difficulty, I think, for people without experience is, as you mentioned there, is being able to go look at the real short, narrow view. Right, we need to put a wall in here. And then it's being able to take out a bird's eye view of, right, and a floor plan, which floor plans are really helpful, aren't they, in terms of, detailed floor plans, particularly are really helpful to be able to go, well, right, that boiler's in that place. So we would need, if we're going to create a bedroom there, we would need to move that. And, all of these things, like you said, move them around. And then that starts to go, well, now we can start building these things. And I think it's that level of detail on not knowing it's the knock-on effect or the consequence of doing something here, how that impacts your plumbing, your electrics, maybe some stud work, access to it. If you want to put another bedroom in, well, you're now blocking off access to the bathroom, in which case we need to do something with that, or there's a walkway or those types of things, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things I teach people is to have a look at where the challenges are from the details, the estate agent's details. Have a look at the photos, have a look at the floor plans. Don't go and view a property to see how tatty the kitchen is. The kitchen's tatty. You're replacing the kitchen. Look for the inherent structural problems with a property, damp, structural movement, and timber decay and things like that. And then look for where the challenges are. We know we're going to put a wall in. That's simple. We don't need to go there to know about a wall. But look for the knock-on effects of that wall. Look for the knock-on effects of... I've seen people show me plans where, well, we'll just take this wall down and extend this room into this room. And it's like, do you realise that there's a difference in level there? You can tell that because out on the hallway, there's 3 steps between these 2 parts of the house. And it's only when you look at it properly will you see that. And that's what some people will own. with experience will know from the plans, but more importantly, will be looking at on site when they go viewing. And a lot of this is experience, really. A lot of this is just, learning from other people, listening to what other people's mistakes are. Sadly, not enough people share their mistakes, at networking meetings, and I wish more would, really, because so many more people could learn from those. But as I said, go and see other people's properties and just see what they're doing, and you'll learn from other people's ideas and their stories.
And like you said, generally in property circles, people are really honest and helpful, and they want to help people, show them and things. So there's plenty of you just got to ask, haven't you? I think that's the key.
Absolutely. And remember, some of these people are running these open days to get investors. Now, you might not be going along as an investor, but they need someone asking them good questions in front of those investors to allow them to demonstrate their credibility. So you're helping them out by asking some good questions, because that's giving credibility to them and their business anyway. Yeah,
absolutely. So how would you, when we're looking at, so we're still probably talking about then the I think the two parts. I think from our perspective, we see a lot of deals land on our desk that people want to kind of look at, and we sometimes will take a bit of a sense check. They say, we're going to buy this for 100, we're going to spend 50, it's going to be worth 200. And we kind of have to, we take their word for it, right? Because that's not our role, but we will do a bit of a sense check. And if you say, right, we're going to put a new roof, we're going to rewire, new bathroom, new kitchen, new flooring, redecorate, that's 15,000. We're like, yeah, are you sure? Where did you get that figure from? Well, my brother's a roofer, my brother-in-law is an electrician, all of these, I'm a plumber, and all the family's going to paint it on the weekends. You're thinking, well, basically all you're paying for is materials, in which case that does make sense. Whereas if it's like, oh, I don't really know, or whatever, I did a refurb 20 years ago and that's what it cost me, because we've heard that as well. That's where people kind of fall in. So we'll sense check it, but ultimately that's not our role. And so what would your advice be to people who are in this position? We've talked about the price per square meter. And I know that's what some people use, more so for bigger projects and developments, maybe new builds, but also big refurbs. Do you have any advice on that? Obviously, you mentioned just kind of writing a list and just sense checking, is it? Maybe creating a spreadsheet, trying to list down all of the works involved, and then trying to find the prices to match that work elsewhere.
Yeah, as best as you can. There's obviously other property investors you can talk to. Another really good resource is YPN magazine, Your Property Network magazine. There's articles in there on a monthly basis where there are prices broken down as to how much investors spent on elements of the work. So if you've got a load of back editions of that, you'll have quite a lot of resources you can refer to there. And ultimately, this is where I fit in, because not only do I write for YPN, but I'm also here to teach people how to price up their budgets as well. And they're welcome, obviously, to get in touch with me off the back of this. But if you were doing a large project, and let's just say, you're buying a big property, that you're commercial property, you're going to convert into residential, you've got an all-in budget of £500,000, you would go and get yourself a quantity surveyor to do this work for you. Because in the grand scheme of things, £1,000 and something for a quantity surveyor to get £1 million project or a £500,000 project is worthwhile. If you're buying a small terraced house that's £100,000 and you're spending £20,000-30,000 on it, then you clearly can't afford the quantity surveyor, and therefore the only other person that can do it is you. And the only way you can do it is either to spend a lot of time doing some research, or actually spending some money but a one-off price to kind of learn how to do it in the first place. And this goes back to your other question about how do you manage a small project? And when does a small project need a project manager? It's kind of that same question. At what point can you justify a project manager? Because not nominally, people would say the cost of a project manager is about 10% of the build cost. Now, bigger projects, that percentage comes down, maybe even as low as 5% on the big projects, but on small projects, that goes up. So you don't expect to do a £20,000 refurbishment and have a project manager for £2,000 because they don't get out of bed for 4.5. So you get to this point. So as far as when do you pay for someone, it's if you can justify it in your budget in the first place and you believe it's good value, then you pay for someone. If you've got a full-time business elsewhere that's generating, that takes up most of your time, you may well say, actually, even though it's only a small project, I want a project manager because I haven't got the time to do it. Or perhaps you haven't got any, perhaps you're not even interested in managing it yourself. So, but the key thing is if you want a project manager, you must put it in the appraisal in the first place before you stack the deal up. Otherwise, the project manager takes any profit that was left in there, at which point we're back to the point where you might just as well have bought a property ready to move a tenant into. So the whole thing goes hand in hand. But I would say I've got clients working with me that have done, loads of them have done house to HMO conversions. Many of them have done small commercial conversions. The biggest in there, I had a couple of clients who built a block of 4 flats in quite an expensive part of London as well. So £1 million project they built, and they did it all themselves just with my support. But then I've got, there's other people. When I was working as a project manager, I did have the occasional client that was spending less than £10,000 on the work, but did not want to get involved with builders or anything that went with it, and were prepared to spend a bit of money for one of my team to come along and help them.
That's interesting. And you mentioned there around a question that popped into my mind as you mentioned that then. If someone was to engage a project manager, would that person, and again, this is probably depending on the scope of the works, would that person manage the build tender process with builders, or would they actually project manage individual trades and project manage the whole project instead of a builder, and therefore replace the builder's profit margin, and that's what you're paying the project manager for?
Yeah. So if you went to a project manager, someone who knew construction project management properly, then they would always engage a general builder. There are people within property investing circles that call themselves a project manager, but within construction circles, the person who manages individual tradesmen effectively is a foreman. So the foreman is there on site every day of the week, making sure that the tradesmen know what they're doing, the work's coordinated, the materials are right, the site's tidy, etc., etc. Foremen are then several foremen are managed by one project manager at that next tier up. And my view is that if we as property investors are managing individual tradesmen, then we're effectively valuing our time as a foreman. And I think we're all beyond being foremen. We should be considering ourselves as managers, and we should be in a position where we could manage multiple properties at the same time, or multiple projects at the same time, if that was where we wanted to get to. So if you're finding project managers that say they'll manage individual tradesmen, I would generally suspect they haven't got a construction background, in which case you've got to question whether they've actually got the skills and knowledge to do the job that you're paying them for. Because the final thing to say here is, if they're managing individual tradesmen, it technically makes them a building contractor under the CDM health and safety legislation, which means they're taking on an enormous amount of health and safety responsibility, which I suspect they don't know what they're doing in that respect either.
In which case, that brings another set of challenges. That's gold. I think that's super, super, super important for people to understand. And that's very valuable. Thank you, Martin, because just the key difference between a foreman and a project manager is I think one that I hadn't quite, and you've described that perfectly, to understand the difference between the two and how those roles are different. And, if someone's, presenting themselves as a project manager and that's not quite what they are, then, like you said, that does open up some risks for you, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And those are the kinds of things that ultimately your monitoring surveyor working, with your lender's monitoring surveyor will pick up those kinds of things just from the language and the conversation when, and the documentation and things like that. They'll see that very early on.
Yeah. One thing we haven't spoken about, just to move on a little bit, because I'm conscious of your time as well. What about contingencies? What do you think people miss this? Do you think people over budget, under budget, forget it altogether? What's your guide on it?
There's definitely some that forget it altogether. The thing with contingencies is we need to be aware that contingencies are for elements of the project that couldn't have been known about in the first place. So we shouldn't really be considering a contingency for something I missed out. Something I missed out means do better research, do better inspections at the time. The other thing to be aware of with contingencies is with conversions and refurbishments, there is much higher chance of unforeseens coming along. It's not until we take out the kitchen do we find the floors rotted. It's not until we take some plaster off do we find that we've got some structural movement and things like that. And the kinds of problems we're going to find are never the cheap kinds of things. They're always the things that need some, perhaps a few £100, £500, £600, £700 worth of report first off, or a structural engineer to sort something out.
Another professional, absolutely.
That's right. So then we've got some remedy. So I say to everyone, as an absolute minimum with a refurbishment, you want 10% of your build cost as a contingency. If you are scared that you've missed some things out, then put it up to 15%. But the other thing with a contingency is, as the project starts, you want to find any reason not to dip into the contingency. So don't start thinking, oh well, I've got a bit of spare money, so I'll put the gold leaf wallpaper up on the wall, or I'll put a higher spec kitchen in. You want that contingency in your pocket as bonus profit at the end of the project, really. And that's where I see other people go wrong with contingencies. It's like, oh well, I haven't spent it, so now I'm going to put in a more expensive kitchen. But if it didn't need the more expensive kitchen in the first place, don't bother spending the money on it now. But do try and get your price right in the first place.
Yeah. Okay, great. And then in terms of refurbishments, what in your experience, what type of refurbishments add the most value to projects? So different things in different areas. And to some extent, the more you can do, generally, the more value you can add. But that's a very broad brush statement. But I think the other thing to consider here is, what are you actually happy delivering? If you're brand new to all of this, and this is your first project, and you haven't got any processes, you haven't really got any contacts, and you're just dipping your toe in the water, now is not the time to go out and get a commercial property and convert that to residential, because that's an enormous step for your first project. So your first project, and where there's still good value add, is take a 1-bedroom flat and convert it into a 2-bedroom flat by relocating the kitchen. It's low risk, it's fairly quick and easy to do, and you by and large, the value, the difference in price between a 1-bedroom flat and a 2-bedroom flat in your area, and if you can do the work in the middle there. But I wouldn't be doing that on a property that is top of the range. I'd be doing that on a property that already needs a refurbishment. So we were already going to spend £20,000 on the refurbishment. Now we're going to reconfigure it a little bit and spend £22,000 on the refurbishment, but add an extra £10,000-12,000 because we've now got a second bedroom. And then we start going on to other reconfigurations and converting houses into HMOs, little extensions, single-story extensions, add some more value. Loft conversions will add value. Basements very seldom add value.
I wouldn't worry about those unless you're in very affluent parts of the country. So they'll all add value, but the more you can do, which is where you'll see some people talking about, oh, I converted a house to an HMO and I added this enormous value. But when you look at it, where they did, because they did a back extension, they converted the garage, they converted the loft, they got it up into a sui generis planning position where they could get commercial finance. So yes, you can do that, but you're now actually taking on a lot more risk, a longer project, and that might not be right for your first project. So you don't feel that you have to compete with everyone else in property. Some of those people have been around the block a fair few times and learn over the years, and will forget to tell you about that first project they did where they did a very light refurb and had a tenant moved in within a fortnight.
Yeah, and that's it. Sometimes it can literally be a new carpets, redecoration, touch up, replace some of the, you can even keep the bathroom suite, but retile it or something like that. And the same with the kitchen. You could just change some doors on the kitchen units if the carcasses are good and put a new worktop in, and it looks like a brand new kitchen. I think people can over-egg these things at times, don't they?
Well, and this is the thing, and you'll see people on social media saying, I refurbished this property for £3,000. Great, brilliant, but don't assume that every property can be refurbished for £3,000. Find out what did they do, and as you say, they've changed a few cupboard doors and touched up the painting and put some feature walls in there, and that's the £3,000 gone. So you're absolutely right. Understand what's right for your demographic, your end user of the property, and just get it to that level and nothing beyond. And I think my benchmark would always be, how can I be just a little bit better than my competitors? What are my competitors doing? How can I be a little bit better than them to make my properties a bit more desirable?
Do you ever see or come across people who overspend or over refurb?
Well, yes, I believe I do, but I don't know enough about their market. I certainly see a lot of people on social media delivering very, very high-end properties. But if I don't know the area that well, I can't necessarily say whether this suburb of Manchester is right or wrong for that, because I don't know. Within Kent, where I know a lot more, there are definitely people over-delivering in some parts of Kent, and I think a lot of this is just kind of an element of competition with what other property investors are doing. And we've all got to get our stuff out on social media, haven't we? And we've all got to tell a great story, but tell the story that's right for you. Because, if your tenant, I worked with a client a number of years ago. She owned property in Tunbridge Wells. Now, Tunbridge Wells is quite an affluent part of the southeast. But her tenants were a charity that were rehousing homeless people. So the people living in her property yesterday were living on the street in a cardboard box. Today, they're now in a property. So all she had to deliver was a watertight, safe structure. It didn't matter that the door handles didn't match. It didn't matter that where we moved the wall, we only painted the wall that was relocated. It didn't matter that some of the kitchen was a different colour to the rest, because the tenants were over the moon because they had a secure environment to live in rather than living on the street. And, that's a classic example of not over-specifying. In fact, when I was running those projects for her, they were some of the hardest projects I ran because all of the builders wanted to do more. They naturally wanted to deliver a fantastic project, but my client didn't want to pay for any of that. She wanted the bare minimum because that was what her budget was based on.
Yeah. Okay, interesting. So we talk about, obviously, we've talked about lighter projects, and now we maybe just move into some of the higher development finance type projects where there's stage payments around managing a project. What's your experience with investors and doing those types of projects in regards to the management of that? Because with properties where, if we're looking at BRR on the smaller scale, people generally will have they'll buy the property in cash, and then maybe they'll have a pot of funds for the refurb, and then they'll do it all in cash. Then others will use bridging finance to purchase and use their own cash to do the refurb, or they'll use a development finance to purchase, and then a development finance tranche of funds where there's drawdown of funds. What's your experience in terms of investors, doing this right, also from doing it wrong as well?
Well, I suppose it comes back to what I was saying already. It is about having clarity in the first place. Going to a lender and showing them figures that you fiddled, and demonstrating things that clearly with the knowledge of their surveyors doesn't work, is only ultimately going to backfire. But it backfires after you've had to pay for a valuer and a broker and a lender's fee. So don't fiddle anything in the first place, because it will all just come back and bite you in the longer term and cost you more money. If the deal doesn't stack in the first place, then negotiate harder or put it in a follow-up box until the seller's a bit more on board with what you want, really. But yeah, don't try and fiddle things for the lenders. You must see that all the time, Gareth, where
we do, yeah, and I think
there's no point.
Straight away we can, one of the benefits of using a broker is triage, which we talk about quite often. Is people that the deal comes across our desk first of all, it won't even reach the lender because we've sent it back saying this isn't, either this isn't the deal or this isn't, we can't send this off, and one of the things that we like working with professional investors. And by professional, we mean people who understand projects, they understand how to present them. So, this is my schedule of works. These are my costings. These are comparables of other projects that we've done and how that differs from this project. And if they haven't done it before, they research that suggests where they've got those costs from. You can see the time and effort and thought has gone into presenting that, because and some of the pushbacks we get are, why do they want to know this? Why do they want to know that? Well, if you were going to lend your mate down the pub £10 for a beer, you're probably not going to ask too many questions. If the same mate said to you, can I borrow £1,000? Naturally, you're going to start asking more questions, aren't you? You're going to say, well, what do you want the money for? How are you going to pay it back? And when are you going to pay it back? And that's basically what development finance is. But you're asking for hundreds of thousands or into the millions of pounds. Well, they want to know what you want it for, how you've come up with that figure in the first place, and how you intend to pay it back. And also their belief in your ability to do what you say you're going to do in order to pay them back. So they're just trying to ratify your story. And then also they're using a number of professionals to ratify, the valuer, based on the cost and the GDVs, their internal QS or underwriter, whoever, to run through those numbers, sense check them, compared to the property, like you said, compared to the spec, and is this realistic? And often then it'll get batted back to say, well, we agree with the values, but we don't agree with your project spend. We're not prepared to lend you that much. We're only prepared to lend this much, or you need to come back to us with a different deal analysis, or you just put more money in yourself. So, yeah, we do see that.
And the thing with all of this is you don't want to find this out after you've bought the property. This all wants to be part of that initial research, because, again, I hear of people buying property with cash. Some of the cheaper parts of the country, they'll buy with cash. That sounds great, but you don't want to find out that what you believed was the ideal refurbishment project just doesn't stack up, or you can't get funding for it because you haven't put a credible enough case together. And I can't agree with you more highly enough with that, Gareth, because I think there's a lot of people that I believe come to me too late for help, and it's like, that my first answer would have been, don't buy the property for this price. Unfortunately you've done that. So now we're on the back foot. What can we do to try and make the best out of this? But, spend a lot of time thinking about the property you're buying and getting clarity around the scheme and the numbers associated with the scheme.
Yeah, brilliant. And in terms of one thing we haven't really touched on is around EPC upgrades and things. Obviously, that's becoming high on the agenda.
Yes.
What's your experience? How are you seeing, the costs to upgrade, the challenges to upgrade, and is it realistic, in your opinion, to meet, for a lot of buy-to-let investors, to meet DPCC or above?
Yeah, so I think the challenge we've got here is it's become a bit of a moving target. Originally, it was 2025, then it was 2028. I think it now might be 2030.
2030.
As to when we are going to have to achieve C for our EPCs. When they first brought in the legislation relating to Fs and Gs, and we had to have everything at E or above, there were grants available. There were limits on the amount that we had to spend on a property, beyond which we could have a dispensation. And so with all of that in mind, we're still in this position where we're not really clear what we've got to achieve, when we've got to achieve it, and what might be in place to help us achieve it. It's been kicked down the road a few times. I think there's at least one party at the moment that are saying they'll repeal that in the longer term if they get into power. And so what I'm saying to my clients at the moment is, if you are doing a full back to brick refurbishment and everything is new, then you really ought to be aiming to get it to a C or above at this stage. If you're buying a property that's a bit run down and you're not spending lots of time and money on it, just enough to move tenants in, then I wouldn't worry too much at this point until we know we have more clarity in the future as to where we're going. Because in the future, this one property that you might be running an E at the moment, you don't have to refurbish it. You could sell it in the future and put the money into something else. There'll still be a value in that property as a family house. So I'm saying to a lot of people I talk to, is don't panic too much at the moment, but don't underspec your current refurbishments and spend a lot of money and get to D and have to revisit them retrospectively. The other thing I should have said actually is we know that the scoring of EPCs is going to change as well. So that's another grey area as to how is it going to come out and who's going to benefit and who's going to suffer as a result.
Yeah, because the government are pushing the not the use of gas yet to do properties with electric only tend to score poorly on EPCs, don't they?
That's
so
right.
They don't match.
Yeah, it's old school where the encouragement was to go gas central heating and electric was therefore marked down. But actually, the electric heaters now are almost superior to gas heating. You can much more easily control each individual room, from time control, from movement sensors. You've got Wi-Fi controllers. And whilst you can do an element of that with your gas central heating, it's nowhere near as versatile. So it ought to be that electric heating will be scored higher on EPCs. But we're waiting for that legislation to catch up with us.
And then the other part of it is thermal insulation, your internal wall insulation versus your external and those types of things. But they just, one, they're expensive, and two, they can, take up a lot of space, can't they, in terms of internally?
Yeah, I've seen properties which have fallen outside of the minimum space standards for HMOs when people have had to do internal insulation, which isn't, obviously where we want to be at all. So if you're buying something as an HMO, that little bedroom that's right on the cusp, be aware of what might happen if you take kind of 3 inches off the outside walls of that. Is that just going to tip you over? And don't get caught out by that now and find you own a property that you're forced to insulate in the future that then loses a whole bedroom as well as the cost of insulation.
Yeah, and those are the things that you need to be aware of up front. And if you've never done any refurbs before, losing space, that's probably something that would never occur to you around the need for building the building control. And if you're taking back the brick, then you need to increase the efficiency and all of these other parts. Plus, you'd want the longevity of a C or above. And if you haven't considered these, you've stacked the deal based on a 6-bed HMO, but now you've only got a 5-bed.
That's right,
and it doesn't stack anymore. So, yeah, there's so many different things to think about. But it's been real valuable conversation. I'm conscious of your time, so thank you very much. Is there anything, parting points of wisdom that just to recap around the key things that people should focus on whilst they're looking at, property projects?
I think I'd go back to the 4 things that I touched on earlier on. First of all, quality appraisal. Make sure you know what you're buying, what you're doing with it, and what that cost is. Number 2, be clear on what you need to deliver. Don't follow the herd and deliver more than you need, but don't under-deliver as well. Number 3, spend some time talking to lots of builders so that you've got multiple builders to choose from when you come to your project. And then number 4 is just consider how you are managing the project, and have you got the skills? Have you got the time to do it? Do you need to get some more skills? Do you need to find some more time? Or do you need to outsource it to a project manager? And if you are going to outsource it to a project manager, that goes full circle. Make sure you put that cost in your appraisal in the first place. Otherwise, that could be the death of all the profit in the scheme, in which case it's not worth doing as a refurb.
Thank you, Martin. And obviously, if listeners want to learn more about refurbishment strategy or how to improve their project management skills, obviously this is something that you can help with. So how would they go about finding you?
Best way of tracking me down, and my business is Refurbishment Mastery. You'll find refurbishmentmastery.com, of course, as a website. There's also Refurbishment Mastery on YouTube, on Facebook, and there's also a podcast, Refurbishment Mastery Podcast. So you'll find me in all of those. If you go to the website, there's a button at the top that says book a call. If you've got any questions, just book a 20-minute call with me. There's no charge for that. And we can have a chat and talk about how I can help any of your listeners out.
Martin, thanks so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Great conversation. We could go on and on about different things on projects and various nuances there, but I believe anyone listening will get some value from that. So thank you very much for your time, and we're looking forward to catching up with you again soon.
That's great. Thanks very much for having me.
What a great episode that was, and hopefully you've enjoyed. I think one of the key takeaways from this conversation is that refurbishment just isn't about making a property look nicer. It's about planning properly, understanding your numbers, and delivering improvements that genuinely add value and not just doing work for the sake of it. So if you're an investor that's listening, refurbishments can be a powerful strategy when it's all done well, but it's having the right people on board to make sure that you aren't taken for a ride. It's having the right knowledge, the right team, and a clear plan from the outset. Hopefully you enjoyed that. If you'd like to reach out to Martin, then you can find the details in the podcast and also in the notes below. And as always, if you enjoyed it and you think someone might benefit from this or value listening to it, then please share it with them. And we look forward to you listening. Look forward to you listening to the next episode. Thanks for listening. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested. And of course, subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.